Hello again. I wanted to offer you a quick introduction to political economy. Now, in general terms, political economy is the study of the relationship between politics and economics, but that doesn't tell us very much by itself. More specifically, perhaps, political economy is the study of how political rules shape patterns of economic activity. For example, do dictatorships have an advantage in economic management, giving them higher levels of economic growth? Some people have posited this. It's also the study of how patterns of economic activity and the rules that shape them affect political decision making. For example, how does sharing health risks through state health insurance affect the propensity of that state to regulate personal conduct with health implications? So, for example, smoking or diet. Do governments that share these costs of healthcare then have more of an incentive to regulate other areas that are previously thought to be in the domain of personal conduct? Political economy, like all social science, is primarily interested in causes and effects. What causes what? But which effects we care about is an intensely normative subject. People care about freedom, equality, welfare, collective self-determination and independence, security, and so on and so forth. These are all things that people care about and all things that the economy and politics have important impacts on. Our economies, for sure, are shaped by the rules and regulations surrounding economic activity. Tax rates, contract enforcement, liability rules, property rights, bankruptcy laws, laws about incorporation, printing money, the treatment of foreign firms and investors. These are all rules that shape our economic life directly. The rules about our economy, therefore, don't just shape our economic lives in an abstract way, but they fundamentally shape the way we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. Most of us spend at least 8 hours a day working to make a living, and the rules about the economy shape the possibilities for those 8 hours. What kind of job is it? What demands your boss can make of you? How easy it is to change career? How easy it is to upgrade your skills? How easy it is to quit your job and start a new business, and so on and so forth. What's less well understood, but still very true, is that the rules about the economy also shape what your possibilities are outside of those 8 hours of work time. That is to say, for your leisure time. How much leisure time you have, but also what can you buy during your leisure time? What hobbies can you have? How your relationships with your children and family will go, and who pays for all of this. All of this is shaped by the rules about the economy, which shape, at least in part, the distributions of burdens and benefits of that economy. There are such things as non-market goods. Some countries choose to take some goods and services out of the market for various reasons, many of them moral reasons. So in some places, healthcare is taken off the table of things that you can buy and sell. Instead, there's one payer and one employer for all medical services, namely the state. Food and shelter or other necessities that are sometimes, for at least part of the population, taken off the market of things that should not be bought and sold, but things that are necessities that everybody should have access to. And this is often done for moral reasons. But there are other areas, of course, that are taken off the market. Sex in the form of prostitution, of course, human beings in the form of slavery. Plasma and human organs are often not for sale. Some kinds of pornography, most kinds of drugs, many kinds of unsafe activities, and some animal products like ivory or dolphin meat are often taken off the table as things which are not to be bought and sold on the open market. Now, of course, prohibition in all of these cases only ever works imperfectly, but it's important to note that the rules shape the outcomes we see in these areas, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. Certainly in almost all cases, a black market does arise, and the study of black markets, by the way, is very much an area of political economy. A different class of goods is a set of goods that generally tend to be underproduced by private market producers, despite the existence of a strong demand. These are public goods. Public goods are goods with special characteristics, making them difficult to create markets for. Typical examples of public goods might include air quality or national defense. Now, I want to say immediately up front that public goods are not whatever you want them to be, and they're certainly not whatever you would like the government to produce or whatever the government happens to produce. Both of those are not definitions of public goods, and you should erase them from your mind immediately. Just because a good's important, like food, doesn't make it a public good. Just because you think that the good is too expensive and the market produces too little of it does not make it a public good by itself. All of these are mistakes that I would like you to avoid. For example, most healthcare is not a public good, though actually some healthcare is. The same goes for education. Most education is not a public good, but some of it is. In modern democracies, the most contested debates about the economy are the degree to which we should classify some things as public goods or not. Because as soon as you classify something as a public good, you've made a case as to why the government should get involved. So what is a public good? Well, a public good, according to economists, has two important characteristics. These are characteristics that are a part of the good or the production process for the good. For one, it's non-rival in consumption, meaning that one person's consumption does not diminish another's enjoyment of a good. So national defense, for example. If I'm protected by the US Army, so are you. Everybody within the territory is equally protected, no matter where they are, no matter who they are. The fact that I enjoy protection does not make you enjoy any less protection. If you don't like the military, you think about another example, like fireworks. Watching fireworks, if I watch fireworks, that doesn't diminish your enjoyment of watching fireworks. So fireworks has this non-rival characteristic where one person's enjoyment doesn't diminish another person's enjoyment. The other characteristics, and I said there were two, the other characteristic the public goods have is that it's non-excludable, meaning that once the good is provided, it becomes really hard from so-called free riders from consuming that good. That is to say, people who use the good but don't pay. So again, think back at fireworks. Once you provide fireworks, it's very difficult to exclude anybody from enjoying the fireworks, which is why fireworks are often provided for by cities and towns and not by private providers of fireworks shows. And it's that latter characteristic, this non-excludability characteristic, that makes it really difficult for markets to produce these goods without help and provides the best case for government getting involved. The non-excludability means that if you're producing the good, you can't exclude people who don't pay you for the good from enjoying the good, and that makes it hard to make a profit. So even if there's a large demand for that good, private producers are going to go make something else because they know that they can't make much of a profit producing a good that has public goods-like characteristics, meaning that not much of the good gets supplied to the market despite strong demand for that good. So when you have a really genuine case for public goods, you have a pretty good case for the government getting involved because the government can set up rules such that the good ultimately gets produced, and we'll talk about what it can do in a minute. So, public good is non-rival and non-excludable. And I said earlier, perhaps a little tendentiously and controversially, that the majority of healthcare products are not public goods. They're very much rival. So for example, if I take a pill, you can't take that same pill. If I'm in the MRI machine, you can't be there too. It's not like fireworks, it's not like national defense. These goods are clearly rival. My enjoyment of a good prevents you from enjoying a good. In that sense, healthcare is a private good, but it's also very much excludable. If I have an MRI machine, if I produce that MRI machine, I could exclude non-payers from using it. If I'm a hospital, it's very easy for me to say, you use the machine. No, you can't use the machine. There's no question of free riding. Therefore, there's no question of non-excludability. And so if you can exclude non-payers, there's no problem with respect to producing MRI machines, or for that matter, pills or wheelchairs or the vast majority of healthcare products. So why do so many people think that healthcare is a public good? Well, I think part of it has to do with the fact that they think the public ought to provide and or pay for the healthcare, and that's a separate debate. But there is an area of healthcare that is a public good, and that's often called public health. This has to do with sanitation and contagious diseases. Let me give you an example. If I get my flu shot, I certainly reduce my risk of the flu. But in getting the flu shot, I also reduce your risk of the flu. And because I can't exclude you from the benefit of my actions, there's a free rider problem here. Everybody who's not taking a flu shot is free riding on everybody who is. That is to say, their risk of getting the flu has decreased and they haven't paid for it. So the market has a hard time dealing with it, and by and large, the result that you'd expect to see, and the one you do see, is that fewer people get flu shots than would be optimal for the entire population. So from society's point of view, too few people get their flu shots. In the case of other types of vaccinations, the government will get involved and simply legally require you to do so. But the case for this, in all cases of public health, the reason we do this is because when you don't get vaccinated, it's not just you who's at risk, it's everybody else. In other words, you're externalizing the costs of your behavior on other people. Of course, even when we've established that there is a public goods case for subsidizing or producing a good, there's also going to be a question about how the government should get involved. Here's 3 ways in which the government could get involved. 1, the government could set up factories of its own and produce the good itself. When it comes to the good of national defense, the government just produces itself. It creates a military. It doesn't contract out national defense to private companies or security companies. Note that there are plenty of examples of governments that do just that, both historically and in the contemporary world. The government could also ask for bids from private companies to create a private monopoly to produce the good. And this is often done in cases like where cities contract with a company to do garbage collection. In that case, you have a local monopoly, and the price of the garbage collection is folded into your local taxes. A final solution would be to subsidize private producers to make it worth their while to produce the good. Here, the government's not producing the good. The government is simply trying to help the development of a competitive market. This is certainly what happens with flu shots, and this is what happens with education to some degree, where there's an attempt on the part of the government to generate more of the desired good because of the belief, and in the case of flu shots, a very real belief, that there is a public goods and free rider problem here. Don't get me wrong, just because something isn't a public good does not mean that governments shouldn't provide it. There are, for instance, some investments that are so large that few, if any, private companies can foot the cost of that investment. Only a government can do it, and indeed only a government can then ensure that investors will get a return on their investment. And governments borrow. You think the investors are the taxpayers, but really, in the case of big capital projects, governments borrow. And so banks ultimately are bankrolling these projects, but only the government can make 100% sure that those banks will get their money back, because the governments have the power to tax, something that no other business has. No business can come to you and say, give you a bill for no reason, but the government sort of can. So governments may also wish to produce and subsidize things for moral reasons, especially reasons of equity, right? Housing is not a public good, but it seems pretty heartless not to let the government provide homeless shelters just because it's not a public good. We have moral reasons and reasons of equity for the government providing certain goods, and that doesn't make those things public goods. It just means that they're things that the government provides. And finally, there may be political and security reasons to let the government become involved in the economy. I think America's farm sector is an example of this, perhaps, or at least it's one of the reasons given as to why the United States subsidizes so much food production at home when it could probably get that food more cheaply abroad. The main reason for that is that the American government does not want to become dependent on foreign food production in case a war breaks out. If a war breaks out and the United States' food supply is threatened, the United States will be in a strategically weakened position. And so the notion is that if a country can be self-sufficient in food, this removes a certain security risk and a risk of dependency that it might otherwise have. And this is a very real problem. Great Britain during World War II had to import most of its food from the United States. Previously, it imported its food from Europe and its colonies, but the German submarines were making that a big headache for the British government, and so lots of people went a little bit underfed during the war because of rationing and because food convoys had to be militarily accompanied all the way to the UK, and many of them were torpedoed. I think that being said, you could also say that although food is a private good, a stable food supply is a sort of public good, which is non-rival and at least partially non-excludable. And sometimes when you take things to a higher level of abstraction, so for instance, a car and even a subway is a private good in many ways, but you could say a transportation system, the ability to get from point A to point B, might be a public good, even though every individual component of it is a private good. These are arguments that academic economists have. We don't need to go over them right now. More recently, another case of a private good that the government has taken an interest in the production of is computer chips, processors, microprocessors, and microprocessors more specifically for government and military computers in the United States. Most of the chip production in the world is done in either China or Taiwan, and there's pretty good evidence that Chinese spies in particular have managed to smuggle in hardware backdoors into the computer chips manufactured both in China and in Taiwan. And this is a potential source of vulnerability for the US government, where information may well leak and be allowed to leak despite the best software protection, because there's a hardware backdoor into United States computer systems. And so the question then becomes, does the United States try to produce computer chips at home, despite the fact that it's going to be very expensive to do so? Or does the United States try to find a way to produce them abroad, but in more controlled circumstances, at least for the purposes of supplying the US federal government? So we said that just because it's not a public good doesn't mean the government should provide it. I would also add that just because it is a public good doesn't mean it always will be a public good. So for instance, the market often finds innovative ways to overcome public goods problems. Things that were once thought to be goods that the government had to provide are no longer so clearly the case. And I think the case of roads and toll road technology is a perfect example of this, where highways are no longer clearly public goods because it looks like through the tolling system, you can exclude non-payers from using the highways. And once you can exclude non-payers, you don't really have a problem getting private road companies to build and maintain roads, because they can recoup their costs by charging users whatever they need to charge them. And even at the local level, neighborhood associations can easily fold the price of local road maintenance and local road construction into the HOA fee or other local fees that property owners pay to maintain and upgrade both their property and their neighborhood. And this leaves remarkably little need for government production or maintenance of roads, despite the fact that roads are one of the main areas where people universally agree that the government should be involved, and of course it's a public good, but actually not so much anymore. And this has largely to do with innovations in both organization and in technology that make the good more excludable than it once was. I'm taking no position, by the way, on whether the government should still be involved in road production, just to note that whatever the argument is, it's not so much because it's a public good, but because you think that roads should be free or something, or you have some moral objection to paying for the upkeep of roads or something. Okay, so where there is a genuine demand, entrepreneurs are often encouraged to find solutions, because after all, there's profits there to be made, and we know that one thing that capitalist entrepreneurs are good at is searching for profits. And sometimes the existence of existing government monopolies in these areas prevent these solutions from ever being developed or adopted, since competition with the government is often illegal. One example might be private unemployment insurance. Most people don't know that private unemployment insurance briefly existed in the 1920s and 1930s, but ultimately was squelched by the government, which then promptly provided unemployment insurance of its own later on. So in the United States government, or state governments more specifically, directly provide unemployment insurance, which is very much unlike auto insurance, which is compulsory, of course, in most states, but is sold by private companies. So again, we see how the legal and regulatory environment shapes the economic environment, and also shapes how we experience the provision of two fairly comparable goods, which is unemployment insurance on the one hand and auto insurance on the other hand. So many of the debates in political economy ultimately come down to different beliefs about the efficiency and morality of governments versus markets. People can have faith in governments or not, and people can have faith in the profit motive and market competition or not. This means that roughly one could have 4 different types of combinations of beliefs in political economy. You could believe that the government works and the market doesn't, and those folks are generally called socialists or communists. You can have the belief that the market works and the government does it. These people are neoliberals or libertarians. You could believe that the market works and so does government. Both work fairly well. And I think a lot of centrists in the United States believe both that markets work and that government can produce results. And finally, you have the ultimate skeptics, who I would call anarchists, who say that the government doesn't work, but neither does the market. And so we have to find something else. So that's, I think, a helpful way of categorizing different beliefs about the political economy.